I never thought a marriage could begin to break. Years after the wedding, I discovered it on an ordinary night, when I opened a drawer looking for a charger and found an envelope that carried our last name, but not my signature. Inside, there was a sentence I didn't remember ever reading, and that, in silence, had been waiting for years to destroy us. The envelope had a yellowish tone, as if time had tried to warn me about something I chose to ignore. Outside, it was raining with that calm persistence that makes everything feel more intimate, more fragile. In the living room, the television was still on, playing a show neither of us was watching. She was in the kitchen, humming a song she used to sing when she was happy. And I was about to discover that happiness can be a perfectly constructed illusion. But to understand how we got there, you need to know how it all began. Because ours was not a normal relationship. Ours seemed like a story written to convince anyone that perfect love really does exist. We met at a time when neither of us was looking for love. And maybe that's why it worked. It was in a small bookstore, the kind that smells like old paper and freshly brewed coffee. I was looking for a book I never found. She was sitting on the floor between two shelves, flipping through one that said destiny doesn't exist, that only decisions do. I remember she looked at me as if she already knew me. It wasn't a flirtatious look. It was worse. It was a calm look, comfortable, dangerous. "That book isn't as good as it looks," she told me, pointing at the one I had in my hand. "The ending is disappointing." I asked her if she had read it. She told me she hadn't. That she just had bad experiences with happy endings. That was the first time she made me laugh. And the first time, without knowing it, she gave me a warning. Our relationship grew with a frightening ease. There were no games, no endless doubts, no awkward silences that usually appear when two people try to fit their worlds together. It was as if our lives had been waiting to meet in order to fit perfectly. We discovered that we had similar dreams. We both wanted stability. We both wanted to build something that would last. We were both afraid of losing what we loved. And that fear united us more than any romantic promise. The first years were a montage of scenes that looked like they were taken from a movie too optimistic to be real. Moving in together. Choosing the apartment colors while arguing as if it were a global diplomatic decision. Improvised dinners at 2 in the morning because neither of us knew how to cook well. The early mornings when we talked about the future as if it were a place we could reach by walking. I remember one night in particular. We were on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket because it was cold. The city shone beneath us as if every light were a different story. She rested her head on my shoulder and said something that, at the time, seemed like the most romantic sentence I had ever heard. "The only thing that scares me is that all of this is too perfect." I laughed. I told her that people's problem was looking for problems where there were none. If I could go back to that moment, I think I would stay silent. The marriage proposal was so natural that it seemed inevitable. There were no big speeches or exaggerated settings. Just us, sitting on the same balcony where we had talked about the future so many times. She accepted before I finished the question. She cried. So did I. That day, I believed life had finally decided to reward me. The wedding was small, intimate, full of details we had planned together. Everything turned out exactly as we imagined it. Even the weather seemed to have agreed with us. It was during the preparations that the prenuptial agreement appeared for the first time. It didn't arrive as a threat. It arrived disguised as responsibility. Her family had businesses, properties, investments. They told us it was a normal procedure, preventive, something many modern couples did. I remember feeling a slight discomfort, almost imperceptible, not because I doubted her, but because I had never imagined that love needed written conditions. "It's just paperwork," she told me, taking my hand. "Nothing changes between us." I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt. I didn't find any, and that was exactly what convinced me. We signed the document on a Tuesday afternoon. Then we went to eat pizza. Then we watched a bad movie and fell asleep on the couch. If someone had told me that day that I was signing something that years later would redefine my entire life, I would have thought they were crazy. The marriage was stable, calm, predictable in the best possible way. We built routines, trips, projects. We became that couple others pointed to as an example. People asked us how we managed not to argue. We answered that the key was talking about everything. Now I understand how ironic that sounds. Because yes, we argued, but never about what really mattered. We never talked about the prenuptial agreement again. We never read it again. We never asked whether we both understood it the same way. We simply assumed it was there, forgotten without real power. Like insurance you hope you'll never need. The years passed with a calmness that strengthened our confidence. We bought a house. We adopted a dog that destroyed half the couch on the first day. We celebrated anniversaries with the same excitement as the first one. And every time someone talked about divorces, betrayals, or broken relationships, we exchanged silent glances that said, "That won't happen to us." Until that night. The night of the envelope. The rain tapped against the windows with a hypnotic softness. I was looking for a charger in the study because my phone was about to die. I opened a drawer we almost never used. And there it was. The envelope with our names. Sealed. Forgotten. Waiting. I opened it out of curiosity, not fear. I still remember the sound of the paper unfolding. That dry crackle that, without me knowing it, was breaking something inside me. I recognized the document immediately. The prenuptial agreement. I smiled with nostalgia, like someone finding an old photograph. I thought it would be funny to reread it after so many years. Until I reached a page marked with a small silver clip. I didn't remember that clip. I didn't remember that page. I didn't remember that clause. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time more slowly. Every word seemed to change meaning as I continued. I felt my pulse quicken. How the air in the room became heavier. How the memories began to rearrange themselves inside my head. Like pieces of a puzzle that suddenly revealed a completely different image. From the kitchen, she kept singing. The same song she used to sing when she was happy. I stood there motionless, holding the document that had just turned 10 years of marriage into a question I didn't know if I wanted to answer. Because that clause didn't just talk about money, didn't just talk about assets. It talked about something I never imagined negotiating. And while I heard her footsteps approaching down the hallway, an idea began to slowly sink into my mind. Maybe our perfect relationship was never that perfect. Maybe it was only perfectly fragile. Her footsteps sounded soft, familiar, reassuring. I had always recognized the way she walked even before seeing her. It was one of those intimate details that only exist when two people have shared too many years together. But that night, as the paper trembled in my hands, that sound triggered something completely different in me. Anxiety. I folded the document clumsily, as if hiding it could erase what I had just read. I slipped it back into the envelope, but the damage was already done. I could feel the words engraved in my mind as if someone had tattooed them from the inside. "Did you find the charger?" she asked from the doorway, casually leaning against the frame. I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was looking at someone I didn't fully know. "Yes," I answered, even though I didn't remember finding it. Her smile was the same as always, warm, trusting, familiar. But something inside me began analyzing it as if I were watching a scene repeated too many times, searching for flaws that hadn't existed before. "Is everything okay?" she asked, taking a step closer. The question seemed innocent. But inside me it exploded like a silent accusation. I watched her for a few seconds. The same eyes that had convinced me to sign that agreement. The same voice that had always managed to calm me. And yet, a question was beginning to grow with an impossible force to ignore. Did she know? I was organizing the study drawer, I said, trying to sound casual. I found the prenuptial agreement. Her expression didn't change. Or at least that's what I thought at first. Oh, that document, she replied in a light, almost careless tone. I haven't thought about that in years. Too careless. Neither had I said, feeling my throat tighten. Until now. There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, but expectant. Why did you open it? She asked. The question surprised me, not because of the content, but because of the way she said it. It didn't sound curious. It sounded cautious. Just nostalgia, I replied. I thought it would be strange to read something we signed when we were still learning how to live together. She nodded slowly, but her gaze shifted for a second toward the envelope I was still holding. 1 second. Enough for something inside me to crack a little more. I hadn't planned to mention it that night. I hadn't planned to confront her. I wanted time to think, to understand, to convince myself that I had misinterpreted the text. But there are discoveries that are like an open wound. You can't pretend they aren't there. There's a clause, I finally said. Her body tensed almost imperceptibly. Which one? I took a deep breath. The air felt colder. The one marked with a clip. The silence that followed was different from any silence we had ever shared before. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't reflective. It was dangerous. She took a few seconds to respond. Too many. I don't remember every clause exactly, she finally said. The answer sounded correct. Logical. Reasonable. But inside me, something whispered that it wasn't true. I opened the envelope again. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I pulled out the document and searched for the marked page. The light in the study seemed too bright, as if it were trying to force me to see clearly what I had ignored for years. I read out loud. In the event of dissolution of the marriage under circumstances determined by proven infidelity, emotional abandonment, or unilateral breach of personal agreements established between both parties. My voice began to slow. The party considered responsible will automatically renounce all assets acquired during the union, as well as any financial rights derived from joint projects. The silence fell like a blunt impact. But I didn't stop there. The determination of such circumstances may be based on documentary evidence, testimonial evidence, or contractual interpretations previously established between the parties. I felt the words contractual interpretations weighed more than everything else. I lowered the document. What exactly does that mean? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the paper, not on me. That detail, so small, pierced me like a needle. It means that if one of us betrays the relationship, there are consequences, she finally said. I already understand that, I replied. What I don't understand is why that definition is so open. She crossed her arms, a gesture she almost never used with me. It was drafted by lawyers. You know how contracts are. Yes, I knew. But I also knew contracts don't appear with clips marking pages at random. Did you know that clause was that specific? I asked. She hesitated. Just 1 second. But that second was enough to make my heart start beating faster. I knew there was financial protection, she answered carefully. Nothing more. The sentence hung between us like something incomplete. And then something happened that I didn't expect. Instead of feeling immediate anger, I felt fear. Fear that my life was supported by legal interpretations instead of trust. Fear that a mistake, a misunderstood argument, an emotional distance could be used as evidence of unilateral breach. Fear that the love I believed was free had been conditioned from the beginning. "Why did we never talk about this again?" I asked quietly. She sighed, looking at the floor. "Because we never thought we'd need it." The answer should have reassured me. Didn't. Memories began invading my mind like pieces fitting together in a disturbing way. The times she insisted on documenting important decisions. The emails confirming domestic agreements. The conversations where she said, "I like leaving everything clear." I had always interpreted it as organization, responsibility, maturity. Now, I was starting to see it as something else. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I finally asked. The question came out more fragile than I expected. She slowly raised her gaze. Her eyes were glossy. I didn't know if from sadness or from something I still couldn't identify. "No," she answered. But her voice didn't sound firm. We stayed silent for several minutes. The wall clock began sounding too loud, as if it wanted to remind us that time kept moving while we remained trapped in that moment. Finally, she spoke. "You're overreacting," she said softly. "That document only exists in case something goes wrong. We're fine." That phrase, "we're fine," it was a phrase we had repeated hundreds of times throughout our relationship. And yet, that night it sounded like a dangerous assumption. "Are we fine?" I asked. The question came out before I could stop it. She looked straight at me. "Of course we are." But in her eyes, there was something new. Something I had never seen before. Insecurity. I felt a strange emptiness open inside me. It wasn't just the fear of losing her. It was the fear of discovering that maybe I had never fully understood the ground on which we built our life. I folded the document slowly and placed it back in the envelope. "I think we need to talk about this calmly," I said. She nodded, although her expression seemed distant, as if she were processing something bigger than the conversation itself. That night, we slept in the same bed. But it was the first time I felt there was an invisible space between us. There were no arguments, no shouting, only silence. And sometimes, silence is more dangerous than any fight. As I stared at the ceiling, an idea began to haunt me relentlessly. If that clause existed to protect us from the worst possible scenario, why did I feel like it had just been activated without either of us noticing? Because at that moment, I still didn't know something. I didn't know that the clause wasn't just a legal mechanism. I didn't know that there were records, interpretations, and decisions made years earlier that could turn a simple disagreement into a final sentence. And the worst part, I didn't know that someone had already started gathering that evidence. There are arguments that begin with shouting. The most dangerous ones begin with calm. During the following days, we tried to behave as if nothing had changed. We had breakfast together, talked about work, walked the dog in the afternoon. Everything remained exactly the same. And at the same time, nothing was. It was like living inside a perfect replica of our life, where every gesture seemed rehearsed. I watched her more than I spoke. She smiled more than she asked questions. And in the middle of that silent performance, the clause became an invisible presence breathing between us. On the fourth day after the discovery, the first real fracture happened. We were having dinner. Something simple, pasta with sauce we had bought ready-made because neither of us felt like cooking. The television murmured in the background, as always. "Today I spoke with my boss about the business trip," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "I might have to stay 3 days longer than planned." A normal sentence. Every day. But something inside me reacted before I could stop it. "3 more days with whom?" I asked. The fork stopped halfway in the air. She looked at me slowly. "With the team, as always." Silence fell over the table like a heavy object. I was just asking, I said, trying to soften my tone. No, she replied, placing the fork on the plate. You weren't just asking. Her voice wasn't aggressive. It was disappointed. And that disappointment hit me harder than any anger. Since you found that document, you look at me like you're searching for something, she said. I swallowed. Because she was right. I'm trying to understand something we signed without thinking, I replied. We signed it together, she corrected. We signed it trusting, I said. That's not the same. The argument started there. But it didn't explode. It expanded slowly, like a crack opening inside a wall that once seemed solid. What is it that really worries you? She asked. I took a deep breath. The answer had been growing inside me for days. I'm worried that that clause turns any human mistake into an irreversible sentence. She frowned. It doesn't. Then why does it talk about contractual interpretations? I insisted. She didn't answer immediately. And that silence, once again, said too much. Because contracts have to contemplate complex scenarios, she finally said. Complex scenarios like what? Like when two people start breaking agreements without realizing it. Her answer left me motionless. What agreements? I asked. She held my gaze. Too firmly. The agreements that make a relationship work. I felt a chill run through my chest. Because, for the first time, the conversation didn't seem theoretical. It seemed personal. Do you think we've broken any? I asked. The question hung between us. She hesitated. And that moment was worse than any answer. It's not about believing, she finally said. It's about recognizing that relationships change. That doesn't answer my question. Maybe I don't want to answer it right now. The silence that followed was more violent than any shout. I pushed my plate away. I wasn't hungry anymore. She crossed her arms, staring at the table as if trying to organize thoughts she didn't want to share. And then, without planning it, I said something that had been building inside me for days. Why did you start keeping records of our decisions? Her head lifted abruptly. What? Emails confirming personal agreements. Messages summarizing important conversations. Shared documents about domestic decisions. Her expression changed. Not to anger. To alarm. I've always been organized, she replied. No, I said slowly. That's not just organization. That looks like evidence. Silence filled the room again. You're crossing a dangerous line, she finally said. Maybe the line was always there, and I just didn't see it. The air between us began to grow thicker, harder to breathe. For the first time in years, I felt like we were standing on opposite sides of something neither of us knew how to solve. That night, the argument didn't end with shouting or reconciliation. It ended with her saying something that stayed engraved in my mind. Trust also breaks when you start seeing your partner as a potential enemy. I tried to sleep after that. Couldn't. Every happy memory began passing through my mind, but it no longer felt the same. It was like looking at old photographs, knowing something outside the frame had been happening and I never noticed. I remembered the emails where she summarized important decisions. I remembered when she insisted we leave written records of agreements about money, schedules, responsibilities. I had always interpreted it as maturity. Now, I was beginning to wonder if she was building an archive. 2 days later, while working from home, I received an email I wasn't expecting. It was from her. Subject: Summary of Active Personal Agreements. I felt a knot form in my stomach before opening it. The email contained a detailed list. Decisions about cohabitation. Emotional commitments. promises we had made throughout the years written with almost legal precision. At the end, there was a sentence, just to maintain clarity between us. I read the document 3 times. And then I understood. The clause wasn't just a protective mechanism. It was a system that could turn our history into a case file. When she arrived that night, I confronted her directly. "Since when have you been doing this?" I asked, showing her the email. She looked at it, and her reaction confirmed something I still didn't want to accept. She didn't seem surprised. She seemed resigned. "Since I understood that love doesn't always protect people," she answered quietly. The response hit me with a mixture of sadness and confusion. "What were you protecting yourself from?" I asked. She remained silent. "A long one. Painful. From losing everything. If one day you stopped loving me," she finally said. I felt something inside me break. Not because of the implied accusation, but because in her voice there was real fear. A fear she had never shown me. "I never gave you reasons to think that," I said. She slowly lifted her gaze. "It's not just about you," she replied. "It's about what I saw happen in my family, about how someone can promise to stay and then disappear, taking everything with them." For the first time since the discovery, I felt something different from anger. I felt understanding. But that understanding came with something darker. The sensation that we had built our relationship on 2 different truths. I believed love was enough. She believed love needed legal support. So, was this always a contingency plan? I asked. "It was always emotional insurance," she replied. The phrase left me speechless. Because I understood something terrifying. For her, our relationship was deeply real, but also potentially temporary. That night, we didn't sleep together. She stayed on the couch. I stayed in the bedroom. Not because we were fighting, but because neither of us knew how to cross the space that had opened between us. As I stared into the darkness of the ceiling, a new idea began to form in my mind. If she had been documenting our agreements, then there was probably already a complete record of our relationship. And if that record existed, it could be used to prove that one of us had failed. The next day, driven by a mixture of fear and the need to understand, I did something that would change everything. I searched through our shared cloud folder. I found dozens of documents organized by dates, transcribed conversations, summarized decisions, personal notes. But what truly made my heart stop was a folder with a name I had never seen before: Emotional Compliance Evaluation. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were periodic reports, analyses of our arguments, observations about changes in my behavior, interpretations of moments where, according to the document, I had reduced my emotional commitment. Each report ended with an identical sentence: record archived as preventive backup. I felt the world spin slower, because in that instant I understood something that left me breathless. Not only had we signed a dangerous clause, someone had been preparing for years to use it. And the worst part, I still didn't know if that person was my wife or someone else. They say that when love breaks, it hurts. But no one warns you what it feels like when love begins to resemble a case file. I opened the folder a second time, convinced that I had misunderstood what I was seeing. Maybe they were personal notes. Maybe it was an exaggerated way of organizing thoughts. It wasn't. Every file was dated. Every conversation had direct quotes. Every disagreement had a cold, structured, almost clinical analysis. There were observations about my silences, about my mood changes after work, about arguments I remembered as passing moments. but that appeared there classified as patterns of emotional disconnection. I felt a weight in my chest so intense that I had to close the laptop. Because suddenly, our story no longer seemed like a relationship. It looked like a case. I waited for her to come home. I didn't want to keep discovering things alone. I didn't want my mind filling the empty spaces with paranoia. When she walked through the door, I knew something inside me could no longer go back. "We need to talk," I said bluntly. She set her bag on the table, watching me with a calmness that was beginning to unsettle me. "I figured," she replied. I showed her the laptop open on the dining table. The folder was still there. Her reaction was almost imperceptible. But enough. Her shoulders tensed just a few millimeters. "What is this?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she closed her eyes, as if she had been waiting for that moment for years. "They're records," she finally said. "They're not records," I replied. "They're evaluations." The silence between us became unbearable. "I needed to understand how our relationship was evolving," she said quietly. I felt my blood boil. "Understand? Or document?" She lifted her gaze. "Both." The words fell like a hammer. "Since when have you been doing this?" I asked. "Since the 2nd year of marriage." The answer left me breathless. 2 years. That meant that more than 70% of our relationship was archived. "Why?" I asked, this time without anger, only with deep sadness. She took a moment before responding. "Because the prenuptial agreement didn't just protect assets," she finally said. "It protected stability if something went wrong. And for you, something going wrong meant that I had bad days," I asked, feeling my voice crack. "No," she replied, tears forming in her eyes. "It was the possibility that you might stop being emotionally present without realizing it." The explanation hit me with a mixture of understanding and devastation. Because, for the first time, I understood that she didn't see those documents as weapons. She saw them as shields. But even so, I felt hurt. "Do you know what it feels like to discover that your wife has been evaluating your behavior for years?" I asked. She didn't answer. Because we both knew the answer. That same week, I made the decision I never imagined I would make. I consulted a lawyer. Walking into the law office felt like crossing an invisible border. The place smelled like polished wood and coffee that was too strong. Framed diplomas covered every wall, as if each one confirmed that I was about to hear a truth that could not be softened. The lawyer read the agreement silently for several minutes. His expression didn't change, and that worried me more than any reaction. "This is one of the most detailed prenuptial contracts I've ever seen," he finally said. "Is that good or bad?" I asked. He looked up. "It depends on who is in a position to prove a breach." I felt a knot form in my throat. I explained about the documents, the records, the reports. The lawyer asked to see them. He examined each file with meticulous attention. He took notes, marked paragraphs, underlined phrases. Time seemed to stop. "Who prepared these reports?" he asked. "My wife, I think," I replied. He frowned. "They don't look like they were written by someone without professional guidance." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does that mean?" I asked. The lawyer slowly closed the laptop. "It means that these documents could be used as structured evidence to demonstrate a pattern of emotional noncompliance, according to the clause you signed." The room seemed to grow smaller. "Emotional noncompliance. Can that be enough to activate the clause?" I asked. "If it's supported by consistent records, yes." I felt the air vanish from my lungs. "What would happen if that clause is activated?" I asked, even though I feared the answer. The lawyer spoke with brutal calmness. The party considered responsible could lose the entirety of assets acquired during the marriage, including joint projects, properties, and shared investments. My mind began calculating numbers, memories, years of shared effort, all reduced to a legal possibility. But this requires someone to initiate the process, right? I asked. The lawyer stared at me. Not necessarily. It only requires a formal interpretation of noncompliance to exist. Silence fell like a sentence. I left the office feeling that the outside world was too bright, too loud, too normal for what I had just discovered. But the worst was not over. That night I confronted her again. Not with accusations. With questions. Did you consult someone to create those records? I asked. She hesitated. That moment confirmed what I feared. Yes, she finally answered. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Who? Her hands began to tremble slightly. A legal advisor, recommended by my family. The silence that followed was devastating. Because I understood that this hadn't just been an individual decision. It had been a system. Since when? I asked. Since we signed the agreement. The revelation hit me with painful clarity. While I was celebrating our marriage, someone was already planning how to document its possible end. So, all of this was inevitable for you? I asked. She quickly shook her head, tears now falling uncontrollably. No, I just wanted to be prepared, in case someday we stopped being what we were. I looked at her, and for the first time in our entire history, I felt that the person in front of me was completely honest. But that honesty was arriving too late. Were you planning to use those records? I asked quietly. She closed her eyes. And that gesture gave me the answer before she spoke. Only if it was necessary, she whispered. I felt something inside me break irreversibly. Not because I believed she wanted to destroy me, but because I understood that our relationship had always had an emergency exit carefully designed, and I never knew it existed. Then tell me something, I said, my voice trembling. Did you ever stop seeing me as your husband and start seeing me as a potential legal case? She cried in silence. She didn't answer, because she didn't need to. But just when I thought there couldn't be anything more devastating, she said something that changed everything. I wasn't the one who started gathering the most important evidence. I felt my heart stop. What do you mean? She looked at me with a mixture of guilt and fear. My family has copies of all the records. The world seemed to freeze. Because in that instant I understood something terrifying. Our relationship was not just at risk. It had been observed, archived, evaluated by people who had never been part of our marriage. They believe you've already broken the emotional agreement, she whispered. The sentence fell like a silent explosion. Why? I asked, feeling my voice barely exist. She hesitated, as if saying it out loud meant crossing a line that could never be undone. Because someone gave them recent evidence. The air became unbearable. What evidence? She looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Evidence that months ago, you stopped fulfilling a promise we made, and you didn't know it. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Because in that moment I understood something that froze my blood. Maybe the clause wasn't waiting to be activated. Maybe it had already been activated. There are moments in life when you wish everything were a misunderstanding. That moment was not one of them. Which promise did I break? I asked, feeling each word come out with difficulty. She looked at me as if she were about to say something that would also destroy her. The promise we made on the balcony, before we got engaged. The memory struck my mind like lightning. The cold of that night. The city lights. the shared blanket, her head resting on my shoulder. We promised, she continued, her voice trembling, that if either of us ever started to feel emotionally distant, we would say it before it became a habit. I felt a void open inside me, because I remembered that conversation. And I remembered something worse. I remembered not keeping it. Months earlier, work had started consuming my time. Responsibilities grew, trips increased, nights in front of the laptop became normal. I never stopped loving her. I never stopped thinking about our future. But yes, I stopped telling her how I felt. And that, according to the agreement we signed, could be interpreted as progressive emotional abandonment. It wasn't intentional, I said, feeling desperation begin to rise through my chest. I was just trying to hold together everything we built. She nodded slowly, tears falling silently. I know. That's how I saw it at first too. At first, her breathing became unstable. Until my family started analyzing the records. The silence that followed was unbearable. Because I understood that our story had been reviewed like a corporate report. They think you changed, she whispered, that you stopped fulfilling the emotional agreement. Almost a year ago. I felt time stop. And what do you think? I asked. She closed her eyes, as if that question were the hardest in our entire relationship. I think we started to stop talking to each other without realizing it. The honesty of her answer pierced me more than any accusation. Because it was true. For minutes, neither of us spoke. The air between us was filled with memories we no longer knew how to hold on to. Finally, I asked the question that would change everything. Did your family start the legal process? She hesitated. And in that second, I knew the answer would be devastating. Yes, she whispered. I felt something inside me collapse in silence. Since when? 3 weeks ago. The world seemed to drift away from me. 3 weeks. That meant that while we were arguing, while we were trying to understand each other, the process had already begun. Were you in agreement with it? I asked. She broke down in tears. I didn't know, until 2 days ago. I looked at her, trying to process this new layer of pain. They think they're protecting me, she continued. They think they're making sure I don't lose everything if the relationship collapses. I watched her for several seconds. And in that moment, I understood something that paralyzed me. She was also trapped inside the same contract that was destroying us. Do you want to continue with this? I finally asked. The question hung between us like an invisible line that would define the rest of our lives. She didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the window. Outside, the city glowed exactly like that night on the balcony years ago. No, she finally said, but stopping it means facing my family, and accepting that maybe we're already broken. I felt a stab in my chest. We're not broken, I replied, although inside I wasn't sure. She slowly turned around. Then tell me something, she whispered. If all of this hadn't come to light, would you have noticed that you were drifting away from me? The question left me speechless. Because the honest answer hurt too much. The silence confirmed what neither of us wanted to admit. Weeks passed with legal meetings, endless conversations, and arguments that swung between hope and resignation. The process advanced like a machine impossible to stop. Until the final twist happened. During the final review of the case, our lawyer found something no one had noticed. A secondary clause, hidden inside the same agreement. A clause that had never been mentioned by her family. Nor by their advisors. Not even by us. The clause said, if both parties demonstrate having simultaneously contributed to the emotional deterioration of the relationship, the punitive activation of the agreement shall be automatically nullified. The office fell silent when the lawyer finished reading it. Because suddenly, The contract that had been designed to divide us demanded something completely different. To acknowledge that we had both failed. For years, each of us had built our own version of perfect love. Believing love survived through good intentions alone. She, believing love needed structure so it wouldn't disappear. And in trying to protect it, we both stopped truly taking care of it. We looked at each other in that office, surrounded by papers that contained our story summarized in legal terms. And for the first time, we stopped arguing about who was to blame. I stopped talking when I needed to most, I said. She cried. I turned our love into something that needed proof to exist, she replied. That acknowledgement nullified the clause. Nullified the legal process. Nullified the silent war that had grown between us. But it did not erase the damage. We sat on the same balcony where everything had begun. The cold was the same. The lights were the same. We were not. Do you know what's the saddest part of all this? She asked. I shook my head. That we never stopped loving each other. We just stopped speaking honestly to each other. We remained in silence, watching the city. And I understood something I wish I had learned without destroying almost everything we built. Relationships don't break only because of obvious betrayals. Sometimes they break because of small promises we stop remembering. Because of uncomfortable conversations we avoid. Because of assumptions that replace the truth. We didn't end things that day. But we never became the same again. We decided to rebuild ourselves. This time without contracts defining what should be felt. Only with something much harder. Total honesty. Because we learned something no legal document can protect. Love is not destroyed in a single moment. It erodes slowly, every time we choose silence instead of truth. And if you ever think your relationship is perfect, maybe you shouldn't ask what could break it. Maybe you should ask what conversations you are avoiding having today. Because the detail that can destroy everything is almost always the one we think doesn't matter. If this story made you reflect, share it with someone who values real communication. Sometimes, an uncomfortable conversation can save years of silent love.